Mhm.
Good evening and welcome to Conversations in Black Studies. My name is Corey Walker, and I am the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities and Director of the Program in African American Studies at Wake Forest University. Conversations in Black Studies is a series of curated public conversations examining some of the key issues and ideas in the discipline of African American studies. The program invites students, scholars, activists, and the community at large to engage some of the historic and contemporary questions animating some of the cutting edge scholarship in the discipline in the effort to create new knowledge grounded in the critical and comprehensive study of the peoples, cultures, and ideas of continental and diasporic Africans across space and time. Tonight's guest is a dear friend and amazing scholar and just a wonderful person. And it's an honor to welcome Claudrena Harold to Conversations in Black Studies. If we embrace ethnomusicologist Guthrie Ramsey's assertion that music provides an ideal site for the exploration of the shifting terrain and process of Black ethnicity, then scholars and writers interested in African Americans' expansive cultural impact on the post-industrial landscape must cast their analytical net beyond the more established areas of critical inquiry. Claudrena Harold has inaugurated an exemplary scholarly practice of probing the complex contours of Black life beyond the more established areas and analyzing the thick worlds, expansive imaginations, rich languages, and cultural practices of African American life, thought, and culture. Professor Harold is the Edward Stettinius Professor of History and Chair of the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. A scholar of history and African American studies, she published her first book, The Rise and Fall of the Garvey Movement in the Urban South, 1918 through 1942, in 2007. In 2013, the University of Virginia Press published The Punitive Turn, New Approaches to Race and Incarceration, a volume Harold co-edited with Deborah McDowell and Juan Battle. Her second monograph, New Negro Politics in the Jim Crow South, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2016. In 2018, she and Lewis Nelson co-edited the volume Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Inequity. Her latest book is When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2020. As part of her ongoing scholarship and work on the history of Black student activism at the University of Virginia, Professor Harold has written, produced, and co-directed with Kevin Everson 9 short films: Sugar-Coated Arsenic, Fastest Man in the State, 70 Kilograms, U of Virginia, 1976, How Can We Ever Be Late, Black Bus Stop, Hampton, Pride, and We Demand. These films have screened at the National Gallery of Art, the Whitney Museum, Berlin International Film Festival, the International Film Festival in Rotterdam, the Oberhausen International Short Film Festival, the London Film Festival, the Vienna Shorts Film Festival, the Melbourne International Film Festival, the Black Star Film Festival, the Festival Nouveau Cinema, the Hamburg International Short Film Festival, and other film festivals across the nation and across the world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Claudrena Harrell. Claudrena, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I want to begin our conversation tonight, learn a bit about you and your journey in Black Studies. You have a very interesting formation and intellectual path to Black Studies. Tell us a bit about the experiences that shaped your intellectual journey in Black Studies.
Yeah, well, it's a multifaceted, multidimensional journey. I think that really begins in Jacksonville, Florida, you know, the home of James Weldon Johnson, where I grew up in a blue collar, union card carrying household where ideas about religion and politics and spirituality and sports and music circulated quite freely. I grew up in a community where schools were named after James Weldon Johnson, Mary McLeod Bethune, you know, Carter G. Woodson. And so I like to think that Black Studies was always a part of my being, whether it be elementary school, whether it be church, and whether it be within the context of community. And so when I think about my journey in Black Studies, and if we think about Black Studies as the manifestation of sort of the Black intellectual tradition, I was immersed in that tradition very early. And so when I think about my journey, I think about the very beginning. I think about Holy Rosary Catholic School, and I think about Black History Month, and I think about learning about ideas and also learning within the context of community. So for me, very early Black Studies was not just about content, but it was also about context and method. And growing up, I think in the 80s and then the 90s and being in high school in the 90s and sort of thinking about the height of a sort of kind of Black consciousness that was re-emerging in the late 1980s and the early 1990s through various Black expressive cultural forms, whether it be hip hop, whether it be for me also gospel music, or whether it also be film, Black study was taken seriously. So I can vividly remember playing basketball and being with my teammates before practice and after practice, and not just talking about the game, but also talking about ideas, talking about what we were reading. And at this point, when I get to high school, you know, and I'm at a predominantly Black high school, the teacher is assigning, of course, James Weldon Johnson, of course, Zora Neale Hurston, but also Octavia Butler and Toni Morrison. And so that was very much a part of my formation. And then I was a student athlete. And so in 1994, I made the best decision of my life, well, one of the best, and that was to go to Temple University. And Temple University, of course, in the early 1990s, was a central place for Black studies, African-American studies. And African-American studies at Temple shaped everything at the university. And it also shaped so much and was shaped by so much of what was happening in Philadelphia at the time. And so I get to Temple University, and there are all of these debates about African-American studies. What is Black studies? What is not Black studies? Questions about methods, questions about theory, questions about normative theory. So my second day at Temple, my second class at Temple, I meet Mario Beatty, who was a graduate student at the time. And I was taking a course, The History of Modern Africa. And that just transformed my life. By meeting Mario Beatty, I met Valethia Watkins, and then I met Greg Carr. And so by my first week at Temple, I am immersed in this thing called Black Studies, not understanding 75% of what they're talking about, but very much moved by their commitment to me as an individual, but also there's something in the spirit. And so I'm taking that class. I'm listening to all of these conversations about what Black Studies is, that Black Studies is not just Black history, it's not just Black literature. Hearing conversations about how do you decipher the difference between the study of Black people and Black studies. And then that same semester, my first semester, Greg Carr had a study group that met in the dorm. We talk a lot about now Black study, but I want to talk about how that really materialized. And it just so happened that that happened to be the dorm that I also lived in, Peabody Hall. And it was Monday nights. I mean, I can still vividly remember this. And so I would literally rush from basketball practice and go. And I never forget Mario telling me, he said, you know, you're not going to understand most of this. He said, but just listen. And so that was my entry. I guess if you want to think about Black studies formally, that was my entry into Black studies. I think at that time, of course, he studies Kemet, but at that time, I think Mario was also working on, Marcus Garvey. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, he was my entry, not just into Garvey, but it was Tony Martin. The Pan-African connection, read that, read Race First. And, one of the things about playing sports, I think it makes you very disciplined. So like when somebody says do something, you kind of do it. And so I read it. And then, by that second, year, I'm taking Valethia Watkins as well. And she's the first person that introduced me to the name Vivian Gordon. That's when I first heard that name Vivian Gordon and womanism. And so I often think about what I'm doing now is just really a manifestation of what they poured into me. My effort, I think, in some ways to capture that experience and that spirit that I felt. And so that was my entry kind of into formal, I think, formal Black studies, and also questions around what Black studies, what was it? And then by my last year, I think the NCAA passed the rule that you could actually, if you qualified for the Pell Grant, you could work 10 hours. And so my first job at Temple was working for Betty Collier Thomas. And Betty Collier Thomas taught me how to work a microfilm. And it was through her that I was introduced to the AME Christian Recorder and the AME Zion, Star of Zion. So these primary documents became an important part too of what I was doing, and this engagement with the archive. So that was my second job ever, to be honest with you. My first job in Jacksonville was working for the Urban League during the summer. And so then I worked for Betty Collier Thomas. And so when I think about my entry into Black studies, that was my entry in terms of content, but also in terms of method. And it was in that space where we were also having dreams about what Black studies could be, what Black studies could do. How should Black studies inform the way you create art? How should Black studies inform the way you create and analyze music? So one of the things that I also vividly remember about that moment, and I look back now at these really graduate students who invested so much time into me, but one of the things I also think about that moment, that as a student, and I know there were struggles over funding and lines, I never was really privy to all of that. But what I was open to were these ideas about the discipline. So by my second or third year, there were some clear ideas about what constituted Black studies at Temple, what made African-centered thought or Afrocentricity distinctive, what was different about what was happening at Temple than versus what was happening at Penn. And Penn was an exciting place during the 90s in this time too, because, Houston Baker was there, and Houston Baker really shapes a lot about how I think about the Black South. Vera Jasmine Griffin was there, Who Set You Flowing? I mean, all of these things were like going on, and so it was UMass questions, how was UMass doing African American studies? What was happening at Brown with African American studies? And so there were conversations about the field and also the distinctiveness of the field. So I'll end with this. There's something else I learned about Black studies. I think being in that space and being at that time was to always understand the specificity of the local and the community that you're in and the university that you're in. So for me, it was like, as much as I'm like here and so much of Temple informs me, I'm also kind of moved by this question of what does Black studies look like in a particular kind of space, right? And I think what happened at Temple perhaps could only also happen in North Philadelphia.
You really highlight in your journey the community formation, Jacksonville, your background with your home, your schooling, the broader community, the Urban League, of course, Philadelphia, Temple, the community of individuals from Valethia, Mario, Greg, Betty Collier Thomas, that entire aesthetic in and around Temple. But you connect that notion of community with content. And it's not only the formal ways in which you're learning, not only the formal content, but also the informal ways. And that goes into your first book on Marcus Garvey and the Urban South. Talk to us a bit of how that project emerged and how it really builds on the ways in which you're being shaped and formed as a scholar, the attentiveness to community, those organic connections, and then the ways in which you're thinking about the Black South.
Sure. So my first book was on the Garvey movement in the South from 1918 to 1942, looking primarily at the movement's growth in New Orleans, Miami, and of course your neck of the woods, Hampton Roads, Norfolk, and 757. And in many ways, that project grew out of engaging Tony Martin, and as an undergraduate, and everybody knows that page in Tony Martin's Race First, where there's a list of the chapters, and there's so many chapters that are in the South. And I think for me, coming from Jacksonville, moving to Philadelphia, I think there's this desire to also kind of claim, a radical dimension of your past. There's a kind of regional thing going on as well. But also in 1995, there was the Million Man March. And in 1997, there was the Million Women's March. And there was a way in which those marches were being framed, I think, in the academy at the time as sort of an expression of bourgeois nationalism. Mm-hmm. And of course, that was the literature that I was very familiar with because from day one, we were reading Wilson Moses, the golden age of classical Black nationalism. 1990s, of course, you get to the end of 1990s and you think of someone like Kevin Gaines, my colleague now, but who's writing about racial uplift. And so there's a moment in the 1990s where Black nationalism is often framed as just a sort of intellectual manifestation of bourgeois nationalism. But at the same time, when I'm in Philadelphia, when I'm in Jacksonville, when I'm looking at the people who are at these marches, they're not middle class, a lot of these folks. A lot of these folks are working class. Also, there's this notion of bourgeois nationalism versus sort of revolutionary nationalism or even union politics. And it doesn't necessarily fit the politics of someone, maybe even like my mom, who did attend the Million Woman March, but also belonged to Ask Me her entire career. And so by the time I get in graduate school, one, I'm interested in sort of claiming a certain political tradition that exists in the South outside of traditional liberal integrationism. And so Garvey interests me. But at the same time, I'm trying to understand the politics of people who embrace local strategies of resistance and local-based ideologies, and at the same time merge that with a sort of Pan-African agenda, who saw themselves as local subjects, but at the same time who saw themselves as part of this larger global Black community. And I think Garveyism enabled me to do that, to understand why someone during the period of Jim Crow would embrace this sort of nationalist politics, this Pan-African agenda. And to me, it shouldn't require a great leap of the imagination why Black people would embrace Pan-Africanism and this idea of forming something else outside of the United States. But I was interested in that. And once I began to engage the archive, so I'm committed to writing about Garveyism from the beginning of the movement, and let's just say from 1914 and say 1942. I'm committed at looking at these communities, New Orleans, Hampton Roads, and Miami. And when I begin to do that research and when I begin to go into the archives, I look at the centrality of Black Southerners in building chapters of the UNIA and financially supporting Garvey's Black Star Line. I mean, the Black Star Line would not have done what it did without, say, the support and the financial contributions of Black longshoremen and cigar stemmers from, the Hampton Roads area. And so I was interested in documenting that history, but once I began to engage the archive, I met people who were Garveyites, but also belonged to the NAACP, who were Garveyites, but who also were members of the Transportation Workers of America. And so the question, how do you hold on to that complexity? How do you capture that complexity? And so I think Garveyism in a lot of ways enabled me to do that. But at the same time, I think it's autobiographical. I'm from a coastal city and here I am studying these coastal cities, right? But so the question is, how do you create a theory of working class resistance that contains all of that? And understand, you're also writing in a moment of Gilroy. You're writing in a moment where people are talking about the diaspora, but the word Pan-African is not used as much in the late 1990s and early 2000s. You're writing in a moment where, if you go from, say, a Wilson Moses to an Adolph Reed to a, there's just this idea that, that Black nationalism is bourgeois nationalism. I mean, and of course, that is one of the central kind of themes of Judith Stein, right? Her book on Garvey, that Black nationalism as class politics. And that's not to say that there aren't aspects of that that I don't agree with, but I wanted to complicate that. And so that's what I was really trying to do with the Garvey book, is to understand this Black political tradition that exists in the South that also cause people to embrace Garveyism, but there are also moments when they critique certain aspects of the movement. And so that's what I was trying to sort of capture with this movement, this tradition of resistance, this tradition of internationalism, this tradition of Black nationalist politics that existed in the southern region of the United States.
You also, in the 90s was also a moment where not only politics becomes important, but also the ways in which we understand the political aspects of culture comes to the forefront. And you pay really close attention to the ways in which culture is pressed in the Garvey movement for its unique Southern cultural politics that really negotiates the complexities of these coastal areas. Can you talk to us a bit about how you're beginning to think through culture and politics in this moment and how it informs this overarching vision of a Southern-based Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, so for me, and what helps a lot is Toni Martin's Race First, but what also helps a lot is Theodore Vinson's, not just his first book on Garvey, but wow, it's escaping me now. Cool. It's a cool in the title. Cool is definitely in the title. And so I knew also, so I knew when I was writing about Garveyism and I was thinking about culture and the way that culture manifested, I knew that I wanted to talk about jazz and how it operated in a place like New Orleans, but also in a place like Miami that had a large Bahamian immigrant community. I wanted to focus on material culture and the ways in which it manifested in not just the music, not just in the songs, but also in the clothing and in the particular style. I wanted to talk about culture, how it manifested in also kind of human relationships. In this really close-knit community. I wanted to talk about how it manifested in terms of poetry. And once again, I think Kevin Gaines and I talk about this all the time. Yes, race first is important, but so is Toni Martin's literary Garveyism. Yes. And so in many ways, what I wanted to do in that book was also provide people with a sense of how that literary Garveyism manifested at the local level. And here also, the Negro world became very important in terms of that. So yeah, culture is extremely important. Style is extremely important. How people occupy the public space is extremely important in this movement. And so I wanted to definitely capture that. Yeah.
In your second book, New Negro Politics in the South, you sort of expand your canvas and begin to look a broader canvas. You go into Richmond, still in Virginia, but let's move up the James a bit. Talk to us a bit about how that project comes in and how it relates to some of the themes and expands on some of the themes from your book on Garvey.
Right. That project happened because of my awareness of the mistakes in the first book. And my need to, I think, go deeper and to really capture the multidimensionality of people's politics. I wanted to tell the story of the New Negro movement that decentered, in some ways, New Negro intellectuals, and intellectuals in the North, but also sort of decentered Europe. And to make the argument that so many ideas about how people should confront the politics of race, class, nation, the meaning of modernity, emerged as a result of things that were happening in the South. Be it Elaine, Arkansas, be it the formation of the National Brotherhood Workers of America, be it the Garvey movement, be it the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So I wanted to expand the canvas to not only include sort of Black nationalist politics in the New Negro era, but to also include labor politics, trade union politics, not just the Communist Party, but really trade union politics, the International Longshoremen Association. I also wanted to write a book that talked about the South as a center of intellectual production. So how would the story of New Negro intellectual life look if we decentered Chicago or New York and focused on what was happening at Virginia Union? So for me, the 1920s is just this period of an outpouring of ideas about politics, culture, community building, and a lot of these central spaces are in the South. And I wanted to tell a story of sort of Southern intellectual culture, Black intellectual culture in the South that also didn't just focus on kind of the New Negro revolts on campus. I wanted to tell a story that looked at someone like Abram Harris and focused on his formation in Virginia Union that shapes how he thinks about the Howard School of Thought in the 1930s, or how we talk about that. So for me, I was trying to also figure out, how do you tell a story of New Negro life in the 1920s and the 1930s that looked at the Garvey movement, that looked at politics. I mean, I wanted to look at the election of 1920. I wanted to look at how the election of 1920 becomes the Reconstruction moment for a lot of Black women. You know, at least they thought it would be. Of course, we know that's not the case. But what it means to come out of a war, a bloody war, what does it mean to come out of this moment of making the world safe for democracy? And here the 19th Amendment is passed and you have the opportunity to vote. So we see this upsurge in political activism during the late 19-teens and the 1920s among Black people in terms of electoral politics, because this is also a post-Booker T. Washington moment in which Black people in the South are having a conversation about what should be our relationship to electoral politics. You know, should we still support the Republican Party? You know, should we begin to embrace the Democratic Party? Or like, you know, or should we begin to think about independent politics? So you actually have in places like Virginia, independent, you know, Black political tickets in this moment. It's a moment of revolutionary possibility in the minds of a lot of Black people. And so for me, it was like, how do you capture that? Whether it be Black women in Hampton attempting to assert their political rights and, you know, in terms of voting, or whether it be Black intellectuals like Abram Harris and a James Ivey at Virginia Union trying to reimagine sort of Black intellectual life. And so even with them, I wanted to tell a story of who are the Black Southerners who are writing for the Messenger magazine. Like, how do we move beyond, of course, A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, who are indeed from the South, right? And not just look at them as members of a Southern diaspora, but how do we look at Black people who decided to stay in the South and be a part of this new Negro movement? Because I think in a lot of ways, when we think about new Negro politics, sometimes we embrace that Richard Wright paradigm. You know, when you think about Black Boy, and that section in Black Boy where he talks about leaving Memphis and going to Chicago, it was only by leaving Memphis, he says, can I become my full self? You know, I have to turn away from the South, and maybe when I return, maybe once I have this other experience, I can come back kind of a man, right? And what I want to focus on is those people who did not leave, who stayed in the South and attempted to create this new reality in partnership with Black people who were in the North, in the Midwest, but also across the world. And so in some ways, that's what I was trying to do. So the first two chapters just looked at Union politics. I was interested in that period from 1914 to 1920, where you had African-American workers battling the racism of the AFL and also attempting to build their own kind of independent political unionism that sometimes does not get the support from these so-called Black radicals in the North. Because they're also attempting to build an idea of Black radicalism that sometimes doesn't include an integrationist agenda. Then, you know, moving to electoral politics, then moving to Garveyism, then thinking about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So we know from 25 until 1930, it's really a struggle for the Brotherhood, but they are in places in the South, you know, and they are trying to build a movement in the South. And then once again, going into sort of looking at Black intellectual culture. So that's what I was attempting to do with the 1920s and the 1930s, you know, from Dixie.
You really enable us to go back and capture, just like Tony Martin's Race First, relative to your first book. It reminds us of the importance of Wilson Moses's groundbreaking article on the Renaissance in Washington, D.C. before Harlem. And if you think of everything going on in Washington in the late 19th throughout the early 20th century, there's this fervent there. And then when you think of, I mean, you think of anything around Richmond and what's going on, the planet, you got the major newspapers, you have newspapers in Norfolk, the Journal and Guide, Norfolk Journal and Guide, P.B. Young. I mean, these are major institutions and they're shaping intellectual agendas and they're also shaping culture. What do you see in, because I'm saying these things on culture because I've had to revise my thesis that we talked about before. But you're very attentive to the ways in which New Negro politics is influencing Black cultural production and Black expressive culture, whether it's literary culture or the ways in which individuals are organizing community formations of culture. You're very attentive to those questions and you don't allow them to drop out. Even the ways in which individuals are organizing around points of production and around labor. Talk to us how New Negro politics influences culture in ways that may be similar to or diverge from the ways in which some of the Garvey politics or Black nationalist politics organize and develop culture in the South.
I may be missing something because I'm struggling to come up with an answer for that. So can you give me a hint? It's been so long.
I'm thinking that New Negro, when New Negro politics emerge, and it emerges really around it emerges in that text around questions of labor, that there is something quite distinctive in those cultural formations, particularly when we think of the ways in which they're being formed on college campuses, and they're trying to engage in an ideological battle. Those forms of cultural production may be a bit different than those forms with the Garvey movement. I'm thinking of the Longshoremen in Newport News, who are doing something quite different than what I would think of in Richmond, for instance. And it may be these are just some local instances, but there's a way in which your attention to it and your attention to the multiple modalities of community building in these instances are quite instructive, particularly when we think of the ways in which culture is going to influence the way in which it works in your later work, particularly on gospel, and definitely the work in UVA.
Yeah, I think the big thing about New Negro politics as it manifests in the South is that it's Black institutions. And there are no white patrons. There are no white radicals. There are no, they're on their own, and they have to be very dependent on Black institutions that may have some ideological diversity, right? When I think of the longshoremen and sort of their organizing efforts, I think one of the important things about the longshoremen is they also their own institutional space. They have their own hall in Norfolk. They have their own hall in New Orleans. And so as a result, you could be at a longshoreman meeting on Monday and you can be at a Garvey meeting on Tuesday. And so there is this institutional autonomy. You're talking about Black controlled institutions. Even if you think about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Norfolk Journal and Guide, and I think we focus a lot on the Chicago Defender, understandably, but from the very beginning, the Norfolk Journal and Guide supported the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. From that very beginning. And so I think also when you talk about the South, you're talking about Black controlled institutions. And at the same time, that does create these tense moments. I mean, I think about Richmond in 1925, when a group of Garveyites try to allow Ernest Cox, the white supremacist, to speak. And these Garveyites in Richmond are like, it ain't happening in our church. It's not happening. And so that is completely different of how this plays out in other spaces. So you begin to think about in 1925, a Black church in the South turning away this white supremacist, saying, no, we're not doing this. And so for me, I think that is an important dimension, in the sense that people are developing this almost just exclusively within the context of their communities.
Your latest book, When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. If we learn from your first solo two books on Garveyism and New Negro politics, We learn that you have a keen eye toward community. You have a keen eye to discriminating against competing and complementary, now sometimes contrasting forms. And you are attentive to the aesthetic and ideological strategies of Black people, to not conflate them to one thing, that there is a uniqueness and originality going on in both of those texts that really, Claudrena, just opens up and blossoms when you engage gospel music in the soul and hip hop eras. Can you talk to us a bit about this text, which is written, the language of which is so, the only thing I can think of is the word love. This is a project of love, deep love. We sense that in the first two texts, but there is something moving about this. You use the term spirit. Talk to us about When Sunday Comes, gospel music in the soul and hip hop eras, and the ways in which the lessons from your first two texts can inform your latest book.
Yeah, so it was love. And I will freely admit that I love gospel much more than I love the 1920s and the 1930s. It is definitely a labor of love. Music is my sanctuary, and I have a special, I think, relationship to gospel music, though I grew up in a household where all forms of Black music, all forms were embraced. I wanted to tell the story of the music that shaped me politically, intellectually, and artistically. And I wanted to tell the story of gospel music post Mahalia Jackson. I wanted to tell the story of gospel music and how that music reflects African Americans' efforts to what it tells us about how African Americans are thinking about their political identities, their cultural identities, their religious identities. So it tells the story of gospel music basically from 1968, the year that the Gospel Music Workshop of America was formed, until 1994, the year that Kirk Franklin became an international phenomenon. And I knew I wanted to stop in 1994. I wanted to take gospel music as an artistic form seriously. I wanted to talk about its sonic dimensions. I wanted to talk about the ways in which it has been a generative force for other forms of Black cultural expression. I wanted to talk about the ways in which it has emerged within the context of Black institutions and has been largely supported by almost predominantly Black audiences. I wanted to tell the story of its commercial triumphs as well as some of those failures. And in some ways, I wanted to say, what would African American social, cultural, and political life look like in its development, its emergence, if we put gospel music at the center of our analysis? And I wanted people to sort of feel the impact that music had on certain communities. Once again, using this word decenter, that was a part of me. And this is a person who grew up going to Fresh Festival concerts, and I wanted to decenter hip hop and soul. To be perfectly honest, I did not want soul and hip hop eras in the title. That was not my, that was a publishing move. And I think in many ways it speaks to the ways in which, in order to make legible gospel music, you have to reference soul and hip hop. And that is sometimes because there's this idea that you are trying to speak to an audience who may not know about this form. And that's not what I was trying, I didn't have a desire to do that, but I wanted to say that, no, you can't just say, hip hop is the CNN of Black America and think that that is the only kind of expressive culture or form that you can understand or think about or think through Black life. And I don't just mean, I think even Black youth culture. So I wanted to write for someone who knew the lyrics of Rakim, but also knew the lyrics of Commission and Winans. And that's what I was attempting to do in that book, is provide a social and cultural history of gospel music. Through some of the artists that I think were at the forefront of sonic innovations, but also were raising some interesting theological and political questions about a person's relationship to God, about a person's relationship to the state, and also our relationship to each other. And so, yeah, it was a labor of love, and it was a book that I was attempting to sort of capture, I think, a certain language and a certain rhythm that shaped me intellectually. So critical to my intellectual development was really music criticism and music journalism. And starting at 10, I just read Billboard all the time. And, music and Ebony and Jet. And so I was trying to also kind of replicate that in talking about the music. And I wanted to talk about gospel music and people like James Cleveland and people like Andre Crouch and Shirley Caesar with the seriousness that people talked about John Coltrane and Miles Davis. I felt as if they deserved that. And I felt as if that community of listeners, they deserve that as well.
And your emphasis on community, once again, this space that allows this expressive genius to flower, flourish, and be nurtured, much like what the expressive spaces of the Garvey movement or New Negro Politics, gospel provides that expressive space, and it gives you that community and that spirit. We're in North Carolina, and we had just had a recent big book on Soul City come out. Devin's first book talks about Soul City, and we had Ed Whitfield. We talked with him a few weeks back on his experiences in Greensboro after coming down here from Cornell to Greensboro in 1970. And of course, everyone knows about Soul City and Floyd McKissick's dream. But you offer a unique vision of gospel in Soul City. Talk to us a bit about what that vision was in enhancing and building that community there.
Yeah, so the king of gospel, the great Reverend James Cleveland, creator of so many gospel classics, Peace Be Still, I Stood on the Banks, Where Is Your Faith? I'll Stop. Actually, just one of my favorite artists. But in 1975, he reached out to the good people at in Soul City about the possibility of starting a gospel college. James Cleveland was very much concerned about the preservation of gospel music, and gospel music as he imagined it in its traditional form. Kind of the gospel music that he grew up with at Pilgrim Baptist Church, learning under Thomas Dorsey, and then of course later Mahalia Jackson, because he was Mahalia Jackson's newspaper boy as a child in Southside Chicago. But he in 1968 created the Gospel Music Workshop of America. And of course that emerges out of, these Black cultural nationalist workshops. I think it's all a part of that, right? But he's like, we need a college. We need a college where we can teach this art form and ensure that it passes to the next generation. He's very much concerned about intergenerational transmission of knowledge. So he wants to build a gospel college at Soul City. It also demonstrates the ways in which cultural nationalism and Black power not only manifests itself in terms of Black theology, but there are other variants of that moment. And so he reaches out, and they make an effort to build a gospel college in Soul City. And there's just a lot of back and forth, a lot of plans. There's a 100-page proposal that provides a blueprint. And it's a part of his dream, and it is his hope that this would further also the cultural projects that are happening or that will be happening at Soul City. Of course, we know that Soul City deals with a lot of resistance from North Carolina politicians, including a young man by the name of, Jesse Helms. And so it's basically this dream is never realized. But when I was looking through actually the Floyd McKissick papers, and I see this big file on Soul City, it was just fascinating. And so I knew that that would have to be a part of, the work. And I think once again, it demonstrates how there are people having conversations within the community that sometimes we're not always aware of. It also demonstrates the importance of the archive. There are things that you can, discover in the archive that are just mind blowing. And these were, this was one of those things. And so it just became an anchor of the book, and an anchor of how I wanted to tell the story of James Cleveland, not just as this amazing artist, but as an institution builder, as someone who's deeply committed to creating institutions where that culture can continue, because that's the only way. I mean, in my mind, that's the only way that you can continue to push forward the culture, and also have interesting conversations about form and method and all of those things. And so, yeah, North Carolina plays a critical role because of James Cleveland and because of Soul City, but then also because of course, Shirley Caesar and John P. Key. And so, yeah, I mean, you're in gospel heaven as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
You talk about the importance of institution building and community building, and you paid, since coming to UVA in 2004, you've been very attentive to the space of the University of Virginia and the space of Charlottesville. Continuing your ethic of really intensely understanding the dynamics of the local and how these how big projects manifest themselves in distinctive spaces. You and our dear colleague and friend and brother Kevin Everson have gone on to complete over 9 films exploring the ways in which Black students have created community at the University of Virginia from the 60s all the way up through the 90s. Talk to us about that endeavor of community exploration, developing new content and information about Black studies, and most importantly, really exploring the growing edge of creativity, working with an imaginative avant-garde filmmaker and bringing together the archive, aesthetics, and a creative strategy to represent that experience of community.
Yeah, so since 2012, we shot our first film, Sugar-Coated Arsenic, in 2012. Kevin and I have been working on these films that explore the history of African Americans at the University of Virginia. And the subject matter has, sort of ranged from talking about the formation of Black studies in the early period, looking at Vivian Gordon, who was the first woman director of African American studies, to talking about athletics, to looking at sort of Black Greek life and the aesthetics of Black Greek life. But in some ways, I think, and this gets to this question of what is Black studies? What is Black studies as method? What is Black studies as aesthetic? I'm kind of thinking about like, what would Black studies look like on 16 millimeter? What would, and it's not just content. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I am trying to trace the history of the Black student experience post civil rights. And to be honest with you, a lot of that came out of just my teaching experience, teaching the Intro to African American Studies. I taught that class from 2000, from when you left, I guess, from 2007 until 2019. And one of the things that I attempted to do in that class was tell the story of Africana studies, make sure that they know what Black studies is, but also to tell the story of how that history is intertwined with the history of UVA. So also to talk about the history of Black studies at UVA. And so as I began to collect that data and look at the early pioneers, people like Joseph Washington, who came here to establish the program in 1970, and Vivian Gordon, I was uncovering all of this information, all of the visual archive and audio archive, Black Culture Weeks, which started in 1970. And so I began to incorporate that in my class. And so Kevin also began to, and we were just friends. And of course, you all have a history and you all work together. He began to just watch this. And so in 2012, the university just basically said, we want to fund a project of art being made on grounds. And so for me, I was like, that's interesting. What if Black studies was not just about cultural critique, but also cultural production? And so we began to collaborate. And so what we want to demonstrate to our students in some ways is also kind of like the art of peer pressure. What does it mean to gather content, to have information, to work with others, to collaborate with each other. And in a lot of ways to capture, and you're right, I talk about spirit a lot because Vincent Harding just had a profound impact on me. There's a River is like probably my favorite book. And, he says all the time, like beyond narrative and documentation, how do you capture spirit? The spirit of laughter, the spirit of hope, that spirit that contains a people. And I think there's just a way that you can do that in the form of film. The material realities of film, but also just when you think about the camera and there are just certain things that you can do. So that is a lot of what we're trying to do in that project, is to document history, but also I think in the process of documenting history, dealing with narrative, dealing with the iconic and the non-iconic, the epic and the quotidian, create new knowledge systems, create a new system, create a new reality, create a new paradigm. So to me, the question is, if like you have an African-American studies program and you do Black studies and you have the baddest filmmaker, one of the baddest ever, what are you producing out of this institutional space?
That's right.
Like, I know if I left UVA, this is over. Mm-hmm. There are certain structural realities that have created the conditions of possibility. So how do you do that in such a way that you create something special that can contribute to the field, that can contribute to Black studies? See, we all have, I think, something special to contribute based on the space that we're at. So that's in some ways what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide that kind of example, the example of collaboration, the example of method to our student. So also, what does it mean when you give a student a material resources? What does it mean when you give them a Black magic? What does it mean that when you give them something beyond the iPhone and they already have the imagination, they already have the content? But let's be honest, at a lot of our universities, there's a big divide between the art world and the social sciences, where Black studies is. So a lot of times in Black studies, we want to critique the racism in mainstream culture, and we don't critique the racism that exists on our very campuses in terms of the art world. How do you begin to build those bridges? And so that's what I think we're trying to do. And at the same time, create new knowledge bases, create new ideas. So if we've been doing this for 10 years, then what kind of student is going to emerge from this? Because that's what it's about too. It's not just about what we're creating, it's about what eventually the students will create. What kind of student will you produce? Because we all working with a short amount of time. You know what I'm saying? And sometimes even, you do something and maybe it's like, okay, this thing is great for 10 years, but it can get stagnant, it can get stale. What's the next generation? What are they doing? And so that's what you're also trying to do. It's like, it's something you said that I never forget. Black studies is a mansion. It's like a big house and we can't stay in the basement. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's about, how do I put a camera in the hands of someone who has these provocative ideas that have, for me, it was like, I think about even someone like a Michael Watson, who's taking classes with me, who's taking classes with Kevin, who's taking classes with Maurice Wallace, who was teaching at the time a class on Spike Lee. Like, what kind of art is she going to produce? and not, it's some amazing stuff. And so that's what it's about for me. It's about telling the story of the African-American experience and being able to capture aspects of the story that you can only capture with that particular method or with that particular form. And I'm gonna just say this, that's what I saw at Temple too. So when you were at Temple, I saw the ways in which Afrocentricity and Africology and the Black Studies program was shaping what people were doing in film and television, was shaping what people were doing in spoken word, was shaping what people were doing who were going to get masters in urban education. And so that's, that's kind of informing how I'm thinking about this thing.
Claudrena, you really, your scholarship, the conversation tonight really underscores where you began this journey in Jacksonville, the community in Jacksonville, and shaping and forming you. And it's been expanded and enhanced by the communities that you've always been a part. The community at Temple, community at Notre Dame, the community in Charlottesville, and a broader global community. But all of that is underwritten by a deep ethic of being critical, a deep ethic of being creative, but most importantly, really trying to find the element of the human in every aspect of Black life. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening. This, of course, will always be in conversation, but this just gives a sense of really how an exemplary scholar that you are, the ways in which you've allowed a certain ethic to underwrite your work. And I can't find a better word than community. And that community is underwritten by a deep love. Perhaps this is the idea of beloved community that I've been chasing in trying to figure out how do we understand this. But I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for the gift of community and the gift of your work to all of us. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this, our last Conversations in Black Studies this semester. Next semester, we'll come back and join us for conversations on some of the key books and key texts in Black Studies with some of our key conversational partners. Thank you and good evening.